1 hour from now, we'll have our third meeting for Philosophy Club. I was appointed president, and whoever wants to have clue of why they choose somebody who can barely speak English to be president, you can go. And actually, what I said is that, you know, if you want to put into test my abilities as president and start a revolution or separation movement and then my totalitarian regime, please do so. We need people. Please come. Thank you very much. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today. Jeff Golub earned his BA here at CU Denver. I can't remember what class you were, but it was a great vintage. And anyway, since then he earned his master's in philosophy at Boston College, and he is just about to complete his PhD at the New School. He teaches for us. He's our instructor in Beijing, so he's holding up the philosophy curriculum for us overseas. And today he's going to talk about Aristotle's metaphysics. The title is The Mumbling Children and the Wildfighters. So please join me in welcoming Jeff Golub.
Thanks, Rob. The title, I imagine, is not without context. We draw a lot towards the thesis, so I'll try to bring that out. These are two images that Aristotle used to describe the earlier thinkers, the Physicists, who were doing philosophy before Plato and Socrates. So these two images are what I want to investigate in terms of their relationship to how knowledge moves from being in a kind of inarticulate grasp of the principles of nature to a more full, robust sense of what nature is. So these are two images that I'll speak about in turn, and then at the end of the essay I'll just sort of put my cards on the tables in terms of what I think Aristotle's doing here. I hope you don't mind that I'm using a laptop, so... Okay. In the last chapter of Metaphysics Alpha, Aristotle describes the ancient physicists as those who, like children, grasped at the nature of things vaguely and could only mumble accounts of their causes. When those who first began to investigate nature grasped it in terms of an underlying cause, out of which and into which everything revolves while abiding and remaining unchanged, they were led towards the truth of things, even if only blindly. Such thinkers were, he says, on all subjects like one who mumbles inarticulately, since in its beginnings the earliest philosophy is but a child. In other places he calls such thinkers amateurs, or again, wildfighters. I'll explain that image. In those places where such thinkers did land on the truth of things, they sensed its necessity but were unable to adequately express it, even up to the time of Plato himself. They, the physicists, had uncovered materiality in the causal sense, but like children they became obsessed with it and rendered themselves blind to the other solutions, the other causes that Aristotle identifies, with the possible exception of Democritus and Empedocles. Despite the prima facie tone, it cannot be the case that Aristotle condescends to his forerunners merely in order to berate and discard them. Some commentators think this is the case. It can't be true. Aristotle clearly understands and explicitly says that these are wise men from whom we can learn. Indeed, it is more likely that Aristotle regards these mumbling children with a kind of reverence, inasmuch as he recognizes that the full impact of an articulate concept of cause could not be grasped in its first moments of discovery, where it had itself, only in a potential sense. Methodologically, we know that Aristotle tends to rehearse the achievements of past inquiries in order to assimilate opinions that seem reasonable, but also to avoid the false starts and the mistakes marked out by those who have taken point, and fallen on the traps of the problematic as if for our sake. Only by looking behind are responsible questions asked and the path forward to their solutions given. Only here do we recognize the knot, without which solution is impossible and innovation gains no traction. That's not with a K, right? However inarticulately these children grasped at the notion of cause, they undeniably had grasped something. And Aristotle sets up their difficulties dialectically in order to resolve the genuine problems they give and dissolve the false ones. The mere fact that these children, the physicists, attempted to pronounce an account of the material cause in nature attests not so much a failure, but a need they felt to articulate the organized fury of an inarticulate nature. That is to say, the physicists were unified for Aristotle by a kind of compulsion to capture the astonishing regularity of a natural system that did nothing so much as persistently change. This is the wonder inceptive of philosophy itself, from Theaetetus and from Alpha 2, Metaphysics Alpha 2. This is the wonder inceptive of philosophy itself, and the response to a need which nature elicits from them, from the physicists, even if their responses were vague or imprecise. So their faults are not due to their innocence or their naivete, but only that they became obsessed with what they had discovered, the material cause, to the neglect of the deeper unifying causes, such as the formal or the final. For while they linger in the wonder, knowledge as episteme does not remain arrested by fascination, but finally abandons wonder for the qualitatively different maturity of necessary, universal, and demonstrable knowledge. For the fully articulate scientist, the only thing left to inspire astonishment would be if epistemic necessary knowledge of a cause should turn out to be false, if, as Aristotle says, the diagonal should prove commensurate to the side. It's interesting, this passage is famous where Aristotle says we must abandon wonder for episteme. But of course, in Lambda 7, Aristotle rejoins wonder and says that even the scientist is struck by wonder at the goodness of the divine. Okay, so this presentation of these inarticulate thinkers struggling to grasp nature, they find and reveal the material cause, and in this they're correct, but they become obsessed with it as a solution because of its endurance through change, to the lack of discovering the other causes that Aristotle identifies. But what I want to focus on is the imagery that he uses specifically of children. So, for all of this, there's an undercurrent coursing beneath the doxographic surface of Aristotle's analysis of his predecessors, and it lies in this image of childhood, an image which involves a recasting of the temporality of their achievements. This is implied in the various ways Aristotle evaluates children with respect to the final end, which will have ultimately defined their lives throughout. Aristotle doesn't have a thesis on children. In general, he seems to classify childhood as a derivative concept, which by nature is definable only in contrast to a fully formed state. So for example, children are potentialities from which no actuality necessarily follows, except for the de facto growth of all organic beings. So if nothing obstructs the growth, the child will grow to an adult. In many of Aristotle's discussions of childhood, he makes a connection to the fulfillment of knowledge and education, and so understands children only as potential adults, but nothing beyond this. Children, for example, cannot yet differentiate mothers and fathers from women and men, their inability to locate the universal in a particular perception. Children, like slaves and beasts, lack deliberation, even though they may act voluntarily. These are all coming from Aristotle, by the way. So these are various citations, just that's not coming from me. What's his problem with children? Children are prone to appetite. They're capable of striking their parents and thus violating a natural order, a natural hierarchy. Young people who are also wise are impossible to find, since although they are perfectly capable of understanding things like mathematics, they are bereft of the older eyes of time and experience, which are necessary to comprehend first principles. So these are coming from the Nicomachean Ethics, from the physics. Children, the perceptual judgments of children are not sound due to their unstable souls. Logical argumentation is lost on them, as the purveyor of sweets will sway children far better than the doctor, from the Gorgias.
It's true.
These examples orbit around the general notion that children are only definable for Aristotle as a kind of promise of virtue. Children are not so much derivative or incomplete beings, as they are an open horizon of potentialities, none of which comes to be of necessity, but any thread of which may, with cultivation, extend into an actuality or even a virtue. Children are thus always tied to the aim or the telos, for whose sake every stage of childhood blindly strives, even if, and especially because, they fail to reach it. So I mentioned earlier about how this recasts the temporality of childhood. I'm going to try to explain what I mean by that. In this light, we can reconsider Aristotle's comparison to his predecessors as mumbling children. The past of a childhood, so the past time, is not merely a serial sense of years gone by, but a past that is closed off, and a consciousness that is irreproducible, except if we try to articulate its movements in logos, in language, or logically. We cannot reproduce the physicists' claims about materiality, and at the same time genuinely be taken in by their convictions, unless we try to, in philosophical reflection. What I mean by try to is to sort of reinsert ourselves into their ways of thinking, which is not impossible, but it requires us to move out of the way that we consider things from our own perspective. Indeed, our reproductions of their work closes off such conviction in virtue of the reproductive act. This is because we can only rehearse their view of materiality, but from a philosophical vantage point which far exceeds them, not in years, but in qualitative maturity. Again, this is Aristotle. I'm not saying that this is true or false. By claiming that they had their day, and these physicists were eclipsed by the truth itself, Aristotle recognizes their contributions as significant, necessary, deep, divine, but dead contributions, inasmuch as they no longer actively contribute to the advance of inquiry. The fact that they are inherently problematic only directs us to their resolution, which, once finished, signals the beginning of actual inquiry. We move through their accomplishments as dialectical exercise, through the children's accomplishments, but nothing further. In this way, and this is my claim here, in this way, the proximity of each child to Aristotle's own thought ultimately makes no qualitative difference. Even the most vivid moments of childhood, significant in their own right, are yet qualitatively no different than the least understood or barely remembered moments, if, for Aristotle, all such moments are defined in contrast to the adulthood as their teleological extinction. So every stage of childhood, no matter how salient or how misremembered, all of them are qualitatively no different because they all extinguish in this telos of becoming an adult. Not just any adult, but a mature, a good, virtuous human being. So in a way, each of the physicists, qua child, has nothing to contribute to the advance of inquiry beyond this qualitative move. Now, I'm not sure, again, if this is true or false, but this is what I understand Aristotle to be doing. If all such movements are in the end definable with reference to their final aim, their own individual significance as unique moments adds nothing to the final product. As, for example, the individual moments of virtue, say courage, are only for the sake of complete virtue, which courage, at all moments imperfectly exemplify. So I think this is a fairly contentious claim. I'll be interested to hear what you think. And just as a child does not recognize that an action is immature while the child still unreflectively lives within childhood, it must have already in some respect set itself, the child, in opposition to something which is first recognized as puerile. This is the reason why we distinguish words like childish from words like childlike. For a child to recognize that he or she is a child is to already have set in opposition from itself, him or herself, a sense of something puerile. So making this kind of judgment between what once was childish from now. So recognition of maturity as such requires a differentiation of a judging consciousness and a naive consciousness, now past, which the child would otherwise live through. So in moving from childhood to adulthood, at whatever age this happens, even if it can't be isolated as such, requires this move, this division of two separate consciousnesses. So an originally indifferent thread of naive experience makes a division and sections off as a concept, apart from itself, what it recognizes as finished once and for all. So now, to put it simply, the child who finally learns to speak will never mumble again, unless she tries to. She purposely tries to do this kind of mumbling. So coming to grips with what the physicists had said, qua first philosophy, requires this split. This is not the least of insights that Socrates reveals in the cave image, inasmuch as the surmounting of one kind of knowledge has a double accomplishment. On the one hand, it brings the knower to a new level of awareness, but more importantly, it makes the former shape of knowledge impossible to recover as such. unless one returns to the darkness and with sun-bleached eyes tries to contend with those who have mastered shadows, bats whose eyes would otherwise burn in the light of the things themselves. So that's the first image. The second image that Aristotle gives of these prior thinkers, this is in Alpha 4, is of wildfighters, or the Greek is agymnastos, so untrained fighters. So this is the second image. As proto-philosophers, these physicists could not accomplish what the fulfillment of their aim demanded, but, like children, they could still represent to themselves a kind of presentiment of the directionality of their developing concepts in the form of a mumbling, which struggles to grasp speech. So again, the physicists didn't fail. It's not as if they blew it. It's that they felt the need, the compulsion to articulate nature in terms of its materiality, and their mumblings, even if they were inarticulate and unfulfilled, still pointed to this directionality. So that is, they didn't fail categorically, but rather had a kind of virtual or inarticulate grasp of nature, because they have begun with what is closest to them. This reminded me of Timaeus, Plato's Timaeus, where Timaeus makes these repeated beginnings because each one sort of falls out of gear and requires a new start. So it's not as if Timaeus fails to articulate his concepts, but feels the need to re-articulate them. So this inarticulate grasp is still coherent enough to approximate the actual truth if it could only one day be enunciated. So even a child can approximate a truth to a greater or lesser degree, despite the fact that a child may be unaware that this inarticulate approximation coincides with an articulate truth. So Aristotle uses a second image to qualify this success, speaking of those who slowly came to grips with the duality of causes, not simply the material cause, but the formal as well. He says, such thinkers stumble upon a truth but only vaguely, and, this is Aristotle now, with no clearness, but as untrained men behave in fights. For they go round their opponents and often strike fine blows, but they do not fight on scientific principles, apoepistemes. And so these thinkers do not seem to know what they say, for it is evident that, as a rule, they make no use of their cause except to a small extent. So let me just focus on this image of what I'm calling a wild or an untrained fighter. And part of this is motivated by the way that a good friend of mine is absolutely obsessed with boxing. And I gave him this example and he was thrilled, but it's caused me to think more about it. A successful or even devastating blow can be struck by an untrained fighter despite any intention to target a critical area. Strictly speaking, the success doesn't quite count as the proper strike of the expert boxer that it accidentally resembles, even though it does undeniably connect, and perhaps even produces the intended effect of the true boxer's aim. So you see two people fighting, one of them just throws a wild punch, knocks the other one out. So it succeeds, but not in the way that a boxer would. And by boxer, I imply the trained boxer. The wildfighter commits to blows that have no proper description beyond the accidental similarity to the actual technique. But such blows, never actually flowed from a process or a procedure. The wild swing was never on its way to becoming an actual swing, and the strike has no account outside of its ad hoc nature, except at the moment of its successful impact. Here, the account of the strike pops into existence the moment the events collide in a flash, even though this account is purely accidental. It has no proper logos of the correctness of the event, and thus, for Aristotle, would say it's only a boxer's strike in a homonymous sense, in name only. So again, the image is attaching to the fact that these physicists had connected with this idea of the cause, but only in the way in which a wild fighter manages to strike a good blow. So the articulation, if you like, the philosophical mumbling, does not belong to the shot itself because the shot is accidental, but rather the articulation is woven from a kind of backward-looking reconstruction of the successful event. This is what Aristotle can do in terms of his predecessors. Insofar, then, as the first thinkers hit upon the concept of matter, or form, they struck a correct blow, but they did not understand fully what they had discovered, nor the role that it was meant to play in the ascent of knowledge. So this links to what Aristotle says in Posterior Analytics 1:2, where he says, we think we understand something simpliciter, or hoplos, and not in the sophistical way, accidentally. When we think we know of the explanation because of which the object holds, that it is its explanation, and also that it is not possible for it to be otherwise. It is plain, then, that to understand is something of this sort. And indeed, people who do not understand think they are in such a condition, and those who do actually are. The one being the untrained fighter, the other being the boxer. So for me, there's something provocative about the suggestion that both those who lack and those who possess knowledge apprehend their state in the same way. The child and the adult, the wildfighter and the trained boxer. The actual difference between the two types is clear in one way, but in another it's not. For on the one hand, Aristotle recognizes that the two, so the knower and the not knower, whatever, can be sharply distinguished inasmuch as the former is knowledge only accidentally, or as he says, sophistically. But on the other hand, this distinction can be drawn only by those who actually know, and who can identify an accident in the precise sense. So you imagine me with my friend, we're watching a boxing fight. One of the fighters throws a particularly wild punch, knocks the other one out, and I say, wow, that was amazing, what a fighter. And my friend says, no, what you saw was a knockout, but the knockout itself doesn't speak to the actual technique behind it because anyone can knock anyone out. But I don't see this because I don't have the account of why boxing works in the way that it does. And again, I wouldn't dwell on this subject if Aristotle hadn't given this image. For the ignorant will assess their knowledge in the same way as a knower would, even if they are indifferent to or simply unaware of its accidental nature. So without refutation, without a Socrates, or the earnestness to submit to such refutation, one wonders whether a knower will come to this revelation or not. This is because so long as ignorance succeeds in the same way as proper knowledge would, so long as the end happens to match the demands of inquiry, ignorance can persevere in the mistaken belief that it understands. Such results can then become a kind of token truth, enunciable by anyone who speaks. And these people can be absolutely correct in doing so, but without any awareness that token truths are not principles, nor of any need for giving an account of their cause. By thus succeeding, in the end, result, as a fully articulate expression would, this success can be misapprehended as comprehension. So what I'm trying to flesh out is, again, this imagery of what I'm calling the wild fighters who succeed in some way in latching onto the causes thanks to which nature does what it does. But in a way that both articulates the causes themselves, but fails in a way to understand them as principles. Now this, I'm going to sort of gloss this next section, but this cleverness that Aristotle identifies, he also calls it, I'm not sure quite how to translate it other than saying just hitting the target, this doing what's needed correctly. He calls it eostokeia. This ability is very important from an ethical perspective. Those people who need to approach and succeed in situations that don't have any logical or epistemic account on their own. So the well-trained fighter can throw a punch for which he or she has never trained in the moment that it's called for, in just the way that a musician can improvise a riff from a thread of the rhythm that he has never heard before. Precisely because both of them are attuned to the accidentals of the situation, and both will fail if the act called for is considered purely theoretically, from the kind of disinterested distance of a pure epistemic concept. In other words, the boxer knows what the outcome of the match must be, but the actual shape of the victory cannot be fully anticipated or determined in the same way the solution to a geometrical problem can. It must simply play out with each moment, and only then be reconstructed once the outcome has snapped into place. All of the individual actions of the fight were for the sake of victory, but could not be determined as such until the victory has transpired. For this time, the victory is by points. But this victory slowly takes shape in each round, and after the victory, and only after, can the boxer fully recast all of the strikes thrown as for the sake of this version of victory. So on the one hand, we have this image of fighters, and it was fascinating for me to watch these fights, because at the end of the match, like 12 rounds later or whatever, there'd be someone runs up with a microphone, they're like, champ, how'd you feel about that fight? You know, what happened in the 7th round at minute 3? And the fighters, the person's head is swimming because they've just been smacked in the head, and then they look at the screen, and in many ways the fighter is seeing the fight for the first time, because now they're actually seeing it as a kind of logos, whereas before it was just this kind of living activity of fighting in the moment. So even the fighter, him or herself, doesn't have an explicit sense of what it was until after. Now again, why am I talking about boxing? This to me speaks towards Aristotle's image of calling the physicists wildfighters, because on the one hand, they did happen to fight well, as it were, in this approach to understanding nature, and they did succeed in a certain sense. Again, it's not as if they failed, but not in any kind of explicit or metaphysical sense, not in any kind of articulate scientific sense. Another example of this, one that comes from my own experiences. So, as Rob mentioned, I live in Beijing, and while it is far from clear that I could understand them, I could, while living in China, read characters, so the Hanzi characters on signs, even though I could neither pronounce them or reproduce them or express myself by means of them, but I could correctly use them. So I could see the character. I know that character was next to the university where I work, and so I can tell the taxi driver that's where I need to go. And from the outside, it seems as if I'm reading Chinese, where, given the account, I'm not. So one could put it this way. I correctly used them inasmuch as I became familiar with the situations in which they occurred as images and the locations they were associated with. Now, my success notwithstanding, I did not understand what I read. Because for Aristotle, this tactic of associating the character with the situation that I'm in prioritizes the accidental cohesion of the words and their application, and it reifies a state of affairs that doesn't, strictly speaking, exist. For in the absence of the pictorial or situational representation, the meaning of the character for me vanishes as well. So familiarity and savviness have settled into the seat of actual knowledge, but they do not count. However accurately I use a word in Chinese, it fails to be knowledge, because if this sight, which contextualizes my understanding, is eliminated, the knowledge is destroyed as well, which is to say, there never was any knowledge in the first place. Again, why am I using this example? This notion that both the mumblers and the fighters can grasp, in a certain sense, an articulate sense, the causes that we're investigating, doesn't yet count as knowledge in the epistemic sense, for just this reason. Even if it does happen to succeed. So that, again, the physicists happen to grasp something important about nature in Aristotle's eyes, but not one in an epistemic sense. So, let me get to my third section. So we have the Mumbling Children and the Wildfighters. Now the title makes sense, hopefully. If it is Aristotle's images of children and wild fighters, if this image is not merely doxographic, nor is it merely dismissive, even if it is these in some qualified respects, what is he doing? What is his approach to such imagery? Why is this mumbling image important? Well, in contrast to the inarticulate knowledge that I've been describing, let's look briefly at articulate, that at which all mumbling aims. So this would be, for Aristotle, episteme haplos. This knowledge is an ingrained capacity to demonstrate. It's a hexis. It is capable of being taught and learned. It concerns those things which are incapable of being otherwise. Such knowledge must begin from prior knowledge, that which is better known. And again, I'm just listing off parts of posterior analytics here. It is known of the necessity of what is eternal, unchangeable, and unqualified. This is why epistemic knowledge does not concern material things themselves, but rather the unchanging and ungenerated material cause. So the doctor can only heal qua doctor if the work of healing is steeped in such epistemic knowledge, the knowledge of the cause. Of course, just like the wild fighter, the doctor does not need to commit to a study of ontology or first philosophy in order to work. The doctor needs only knowledge of bodies to a certain point. But this means the doctor does not investigate matter as such, as perhaps the first philosopher would. So the doctor deals with the phlegm, the warming of bodies, the healing through cutting, and the doctor needs to only know the body up to this point, but has no use for matter in any kind of ontological sense, as I imagine the physicists would. Yet even though episteme haplos is this kind of habit, and so is an activity of knowing, it's not yet the same as a full-fledged wisdom, which I think Aristotle would call it entelecheia in this sense. In the Ethics, Aristotle identifies wisdom, that presumably which these physicists were aiming, towards which they were aiming. Aristotle identifies wisdom as the fullest or most complete way of knowing. The wise not only know the arche, the principles, but they're privy to their archaic truth through a kind of intuition of their first principles. This is nous. So in the Ethics, Aristotle combines episteme and nous to yield wisdom, the most complete form of knowledge. So this, I imagine, would be the fulfillment of what the Mumbling Children would have been aiming at. So this is the major push that I've been working towards. So the passage from the originally inarticulate position of learning falls over into a fully articulate wisdom, in the case in which the knower has it for the first time in its completeness. So Aristotle says, for example, that learning and having learned is moving from a process of having an incomplete state to a complete state. But knowing and having known is always at once complete with itself. Even before this, the learner is vaguely aware of the landscape of what is to be known. That is, the learner qua potential knower can envision what lies ahead and what has passed, and what lies nearby, in tandem with, but over and above her lessons. Nothing prevents the learner from having a potential knowledge of the end while still on the way. On the contrary, the act of learning necessitates it. So again, the physicists, it's not as if they failed categorically. They were on the way to understanding this, even if they didn't have a full grip of that materiality as a cause. Indeed, it necessitates this. As in the case of health, where one becomes more capable with exercise, but the exercise is only for the sake of becoming capable to exercise further, and the supervening health is both the end and the means. Further, the final realization of knowledge, wisdom, changes nothing about the steps whose full purpose were only potentially known while being learned in their isolation, but instead recasts all of these steps as a unity. And this is what I tried to say earlier in the case of the particular moments of childhood in contrast to adulthood. So from inarticulate and fragmentary truths, from these elements that we start with as students, a full and circumspective understanding supervenes over them all, and the knower realizes, looking back as if for the first time, that all of them had been for the sake of this fully fledged and possessed entelecheia of wisdom. This is why the knower does not renounce the stages of learning, merely because they are rudimentary in comparison to what is known now. The learner does not simply throw away the training materials. We keep our books, right? But instead recognizes for the first time how they will have been all for the sake of the scaffold which supports understanding in its fullest sense. Something a student simply does not see. And I don't mean to say student without qualification, I mean the learner in the potential sense. This is clear from the fact that the knower does not repeat the steps of learning again unless he tries to. That is, unless he is teaching or speaking as a child with children. And I'd be curious to see what you all think of this image, because, again, in my own experiences of teaching, when you take concepts that seem so fluid and clear to you from having studied them for a long time, and trying to get them to be clear to another person, and having in a way to sort of teach them to yourself again, to approach what you know from their perspective. Again, it's a very interesting experience for me. But one finds that these concepts that one feels comfortable with, forcing yourself to reapproach them as the child would, or as the learner would, and seeing them as they were when I was first learning them. But now, as a knower, as one who has a full possession of knowledge, looking back at these steps is not to say that they are to be rejected, or somehow that they're derivative, or that they are less, but that they all were for the sake of this final form of knowledge. But only now, having knowledge for the first time makes this clear. So again, in its final possession, knowledge rechristens the stages of learning that came before it, as if for its sake. steps which provided only a vantage point of what was to be known, and in its excellent use in theoria, it is knowing in the fullest sense of the word. So this is my last passage here. This leads to the demand that wisdom, so the highest form of knowledge, is not only an activity, an ergeia, but that it's a fulfillment, an entelecheia. Knowledge is not merely retrieved or accessed as if drawing a file from a drawer or fax. Knowledge is not merely retrieved as if accessing a file from a drawer or birds from an aviary, to use Plato's image. To the one who knows, the fully articulate and complete knowledge of something is in the end indifferent from the piecemeal and propaideutically necessary expression of the parts. I can't say that word in English because I can only say it in Greek. Drives me nuts. The arithmetician, for example, knows interchangeably and indifferently the individual numbers, the properties which distinguish them, even odd, and the system of numbers as a whole which accounts for their unity. But when an arithmetician comes to realize that the set of all even numbers and the set of all odd numbers are equally infinite and yet not the same, or when an arithmetician realizes that all even numbers are the sum of two primes, this mathematician does not need to continue testing this principle by trying again and again to see whether it is true. At a certain point, the principle supervenes upon the examples, and it is recognized for the first time that any possible number will always follow this principle. The known will have been x all along, even if it was not articulate or clear when it was coming to know. So I imagine this is why Aristotle treats his predecessors with some level of reverence. It's not as if he's completely surpassed them. It's that he, as I imagine he sees himself as a kind of culmination of Greek philosophy, sees for the first time what all of this had been done for. This means that knowledge has a hand in a second-order potentiality, but that in its fullest sense, knowledge is an entelecheia, that is, the actual and active thinking which draws upon a wealth of potentialities, weaving together new thoughts from potential connections, which are first illuminated in contemplation, but for the first time in their unity, whereas before they were considered merely indifferent from each other. So this indifference of, let's say, matter with nature, which is true, but for the physicists not explicitly known, this indifference could only be mumbled in its first articulations, but finally understood as such in the completion of what had been promised. As children who are driven upward by means of education and ethical cultivation, out of their need to grapple clumsily for words when faced by the beautiful and good, and finally fulfill what was promised in their muted childhood by becoming beautiful and good themselves. Thanks.
So we have time for questions and answer.
Okay, so here's the snarky one to start.
Awesome.
So Aristotle, it would seem like, by everything you've just said, is a mumbling child.
In comparison to us, or?
Well, Aristotle gives us a syllogistic logic that looks like the crude workings out of a kindergartner relative to relational symbolic logic today. His understanding of the relation of empirical evidence to thesis is simplistic at best relative to today, right? So wouldn't that be the output of our story here?
I mean, one could view Aristotle that way, and I think if I had to be counter-snarky, I would say that
well, that's the only way.
in some ways,
Right?
it's, Aristotle's success, because Aristotle's the thinker that he is, he actually lends himself to these kinds of critiques, because I would say, in his defense,
Well, it
that
wouldn't
it's
be
only
a critique,
thanks.
though, right? I mean, the very last part that you pushed on was that Aristotle himself was not being pejorative with respect to calling these prior physicists mumbling children.
Yeah.
Instead, he respected their role to the contribution, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, and I think in that respect, I agree it's not a criticism. I think it's because Aristotle is the thinker that he is, that he lends himself to these kinds of approaches, being simplistic, for example, from what we know now. But on the other hand, it's not as if we look at Aristotle with a kind of antiquated admiration and say, look how close he got. It's that the way, at least for me, the way that he approached these problems is still uniquely important to study today, in ways that the simplistic models seem to avoid for me. So in other words, it may be the case that, let's say, for example, that Aristotle was being unfair in castigating his predecessors for being too simplistic. Then I imagine we would be making the same mistake. But and on the other hand, as you said, I agree. Then it's not as if we do say that about him, we're not being pejorative. It's that we're recognizing that these concepts are still perhaps coming into fruition today.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons I'm impressed that this, though, snarky as it is that at the very beginning, though, there was, and I got lost in our metaphors.
Sorry.
Maybe no, it's mine. Just listening, trying to keep track. It's, if I remember right, at the very beginning, one of the things was, well, he wasn't going to be down on these folks prior to him.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, their contributions were, I think this was your phrase, dead.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that is Aristotelian logic, dead. Empirical evidence to thesis, dead. Understanding of biology as involving something like nature's, dead. These are not things to be retaught and re-educated to kids so we have to then cure them of falsehoods. They're dead. They should not be taught again. So in some way, the output, snarky as it is, that Aristotle is a mumbling child is actually an argument to stop teaching.
No.
Again, I mean, to
I told you this.
maybe I don't have to say anything.
Should we vote?
I on the one hand, I think that again that seems to me to stifle much of what's important about doing philosophy in general, but particularly about doing Aristotelian philosophy. So let's say, for example, that his logic is dead, and I was being particularly colorful in that example. What I meant by dead in that sense was that nothing that they had done would advance to further inquiry in terms of what Aristotle had done. They had given all of their materials for Aristotle to work on, and nothing could be gained by going back to them and seeing them for, let's say, materiality in an earnestness. So it's not like we can go back to Thales and say that all nature is water, and at the same time believe that, unless we really had to sort of reinsert ourselves into a kind of methodological thing.
Suspend our disbelief.
Aristotle doesn't work that way to me. It seems like, just as a piano player learns to play through these kind of rudimentary movements, the master piano player doesn't just reject them, and when teaching a student how to play the piano, returns to these not because they're false, but because they belong to the unity of that activity as a whole. So I imagine that not teaching Aristotle would be, I don't imagine that Aristotle would not have taught or thought about the physicists for those reasons.
Yeah, and just because otherwise I put myself in a hostile position. I love Aristotle.
Yeah.
This is just for the point of being snarky.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, I think that in some ways what kind of inspired this paper was just reading those passages, and I was trying to in some ways rescue Aristotle from this criticism, but on the other hand, it does sort of cast our own studies of Aristotle in a new light.
With respect to Mark's snarkiness, I think, though, the only thing we shouldn't be teaching is Aristotle's biology as biology,
Right.
Aristotle's logic as logic. But on the other hand, when we talk about Aristotle's ethics and his developmental theory, the one that you talked about with respect to children not being ready to, they could be perfectly bright rationally and do the math and all of that, but they haven't reached a stage to be able to use it wisely. That's exactly what neuroscientists say about the myelination of brains in children, and yes, they can be very bright and prodigious in their mathematical output and all of that, but you don't want to make them be your senator because they don't have the. Well, okay, that was a bad.
We only took the highest grade of senators, I tell you.
I was going to say doctor, but I was thinking, well, I don't know. And, there's a doctor in the room, and I don't want to make a judgment about that, so I switched to senators. But I thought, but something, right? So with respect to what they can do and they can't do, there are things to teach about ethics and social discourse that might, even as those fields of those disciplines and not as history, be taught. So I think the suggestion to not teach Aristotle should not teach Aristotle qua
Yeah, and I think
the parts that are dead.
Or like in Nicomachean
I
ethics,
think
human nature. There is no human nature. That's been dead for 150 years.
I'd like to. Just
But there is excess and deficiency, and those still are vices.
Sorry, I'm sorry, Jeff. I apologize.
good discussion. No, just to respond very quickly to that point, I think that whether or not we should teach Aristotle's theories in earnest is a decision that one could make, I guess, as a professor on their own terms. Of one of the passages that's famous that I didn't read, but I had it. The paper was in the ethics when Aristotle is not talking about these thinkers as mumbling children, but rather in much greater light as thinkers who worked on what he says the most difficult problems and the most divine, but also the most useless. And in the Ethics, he praises this kind of philosophy that they did precisely because it was useless. And it was only at the point when all other vicissitudes of life had been handled that this kind of thinking first came about. So I imagine that one could approach Aristotle's philosophy in the same way, teaching it without this kind of earnestness to make it into a principle that accurately describes things in terms of what we know, but rather in this process of coming to know.
Right.
So I'm sorry, I don't know if I saw first.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, just to second the comment by Candace, if you think, for instance, of Aristotle's views on natural slavery, which were historically used to basically justify, for instance, the conquest and the subjugation of native peoples in the Americas. Well, I think that's a very clear example of how we can view basically Aristotle's own views as basically mumblings, attempts to basically get at the truth without ultimately achieving it, which sometimes have been distorted throughout history, but which contain a grain of truth, and in virtue of this are basically worth teaching even to this day.
I think Aristotle's, in some ways, Aristotle's quick on his feet on these kinds of questions because he knows that issues of politics and issues of ethics are not ones that lend themselves to epistemic clarity. So we're not going to approach those kinds of questions in the same way that he would in terms of physical science. And this annoys people when Aristotle's like, look, we just don't do that. We don't think about ethics in that way. Sorry, next question, right? On the issue of slavery, I think that, I don't think anyone, well, we'll see, but next to no one would say, like, okay, he got something right there. But I also think that his position on slavery, something more was at stake than Aristotle just saying slaves are awesome, let's have more slaves. Understanding the nature of what it would be to, I think he says in this passage, and I think it's Politics too.
Yeah,
Politics,
Politics.
yeah. He says that if such a thing as a slave were to exist, this is what its nature would be. But he seems to be a bit ambiguous on whether such a thing actually exists, qua slave. And I think, again, so this to me makes it rewarding to approach Aristotle's philosophy, not with this kind of earnestness to say, is he right or is he wrong, but sort of just experience that conceptual formation.
Well, this whole thing resonated with me because I'm a martial arts coach, and this is all, like, it's all the same thing. And like, what is your name, Mark?
Yeah.
Like what he was saying. So I teach Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and when the Gracies first came to this country in the late 80s, early 90s, like we look at the way that they teach right now, and I'd be like, that would get your arm broken right now. If someone did that to me right now, easy breezy, I'd break their arm. But that still happened, right? Like where I am today, like the martial artist that I am today needed that to happen for me to be there, right? That was the telos. That was the form at that point, right? And it's just been that constant evolution still. So even in my own training, there have been a ton of positions that I learned when I was a white belt, a younger belt, that I would never teach again or that I never used, right? And I teach my students differently based on that knowledge that came before me of my own prior experience and the experience that came before I started training that came from my instructors, right? So it's just like they were mumbling children to me, and then I'll probably be mumbling children to guys that keep training afterward, but I'm still a necessary link in that chain.
Yeah, and I appreciate this example, both for the reasons I'm not a martial artist, and I know that in mixed martial arts, anyway, the Gracies were responsible for what it's become today. Yeah. Particularly because they dominated it for the first 12 years or whatever.
Marketing was good, but yeah.
Sure. No one can beat Jiu-Jitsu.
Yeah.
But in terms of respecting those lessons that we come to assimilate into our own abilities, I think, so I agree with everything you said in that respect. The one thing I would just add is that in terms of being mumbling children, it's not simply just a sense of naivete or innocence or being a young learner. It's that you mumble because you're striving to know, because you're struggling to grasp what this thing is. And
that's what you're saying. He's addressing them respectfully, because when you're talking about his understanding of children, he's talking about children in his sense of the telos, is his sense of that necessary part of the form that it's becoming. So he's not looking down on them. He's just saying that had to happen, like that struggle, that need that may seem crude to us had to happen for us to progress.
Yeah. Thank
you. Sometimes I wonder if I really liked the way you approached it, and I wonder sometimes if our initial reactions are more like Mark's snarky comments, but they were good comments, Mark, I assure you. But that the frameworks that, yeah, I'm just going to, the frameworks that the statements are issued, they're reacting to something on the ground. And part of what I see as an historian that's really at issue is a lot of times what they're reacting to. Why would Aristotle talk about slavery? What's happening in the Persian side? I mean, it's a very dynamic world that they live in, but all we're receiving are these texts, and that's great, but they have to have some context, and when they're taken out of their context, it can look like they're being snarky, and their frameworks are lost. And Aristotle's, to me, is always trying to teach his students framework. When you teach music, you're teaching your student about the framework for them to contextualize so that they can leave you and become an artist. And that's a different, I think that's a different worldview. Not for a musician or a martial artist or a painter.
Did you think that Aristotle was taking his prior things out of context, or that we?
No, he understood his
okay.
context.
Yeah. Okay.
He very much understood it, and you did actually, I thought, a really good job of trying to place it.
Well, it's Aristotle.
Yeah.
No, thank you. I think that Aristotle is particularly sensitive to those kinds of things.
That's why the slavery makes no sense to us when we read Politic too, and you're like, whoa, that's really strident. Or some of the comments on women. I mean, those really, they piss me off when I read them, and then I have to say, no, Rod, it's 2015 now. You need to, put on a different hat.
Yeah. I mean, as I was doing Aristotle, I always have this kind of, I don't know if it's called a dodge that's ready, and I can say, I don't care if Aristotle's right or wrong. I don't care. Just studying it, understanding these concepts. But that is kind of a dodge, because I do have, particularly these issues that no one's, again, I shouldn't say no one, but next to no one is prepared to defend some of the things that Aristotle says in earnest. But again, it's not exactly scholarly to avoid these issues either and say like, well, I don't care if Aristotle said that because. So having an appreciation for that context of the history in which this thinker is placed, on the one hand, and a kind of robust appreciation for concepts and their formation on the other, this seems like a good approach.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I really found it illuminating, the comparison with pedagogy, and trying to capture the connections that you made in conveying something to a student. But at the same time, I wonder if that is really a good model for our relation to the history of philosophy. Because, I mean, it seems to me undeniable that Aristotle is condescending toward, pre-Socratic thinkers, and he never seems to countenance the possibility that, maybe by fire, Heraclitus doesn't mean a material substance. Or maybe Xenophanes approached nature in a different way, and possibly a better way than I approach nature. And so he closes off a kind of encounter with the pre-Socratics that I think you studying Aristotle and all of us, going back to the history of philosophy, we try to keep open this encounter with great thinkers from the past, because we don't, they see things that we don't see.
Yeah.
At least we take that as a kind of working hypothesis. But Aristotle does not have that hypothesis apparently in what he says about the pre-Socratics.
Yeah, I think there is an implicit reason to believe that that's right, in that Aristotle, at least in my phrasings, contrasts inarticulate thinking with articulation. So by making the prior thinkers articulate, he's already in a certain sense modifying what they had said. And I think I try to use this idea of recasting these thinkers. Take that out of the story, and the pre-Socratics blossom again in a way that might not have been approached in Aristotle. I think that's true.
So in your metaphor of the fight, what is the telos? Because what's confusing me is if Aristotle is saying that all of this has led up to the purpose of knowledge, then how is it that they would accidentally hit a telos? if you can, the point is to knock somebody out, and he's differentiating between like a perfected way of knocking somebody out. Where would that be in knowledge? He doesn't. Does he not see himself as that, or where is that to?
Yeah. So maybe I should use so the example that I used of knocking someone out. Maybe clarify really quickly. That is a hard way of describing it, because on the one hand, the telos is victory. The fighter wants to win, but I'm sure you would agree, knocking someone out is not the conditions for victory. There's a whole number of ways that a fight can be won, and if a person were just looking for that one strategy, then in a way that shows that this person is not a fighter in the trained sense, even though they can succeed in a certain respect. And I think that's what I meant in terms of the analogy of knowledge. So having knowledge in its telos, so having the full fulfilled version of knowledge, is not just landing on one or another correct answer, but sort of having a viewpoint of all of them when the situation calls for them, and being able to grasp what you need. Is that clear?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just curious how you would sort of couch this in terms of the question of personal philosophy, though. The difference in the inarticulate and the articulate and the fulfilled and the rudimentary. I mean, I guess why I always feel like Aristotle is so relevant is the kind of more contemporary reading of Aristotle coming out of Heidegger and Gadamer and all that. The universals aren't, the problem of finding universal isn't dead, I think. You know,
right.
Even with our most sophisticated logic or whatever way we approach it. So I'm just curious what you would say about that. Like, after spending this time working on Aristotle, you're looking at his predecessors, we're thinking about advances in philosophy and what's relevant and what isn't the most relevant issue the whole question of what universals are, what first philosophy is, where the inquirer is in relationship to such things?
Yeah. Yeah, I think someone of Heidegger's caliber could make the argument that those questions begin to transform the way that we think as metaphysicians. I think Adorno might say the same thing. But from our perspective, I think that there's nothing that's going to hurt us by studying these kinds of things. I mean, we stand only to benefit from these kinds of questions. And I think that Aristotle, in one sense, I don't think he has anything at stake in saying that one part of philosophy is less rudimentary or more developed, even though he can have this condescension, as Rob mentioned. So when he speaks about Plato, it's almost always in criticism. But this doesn't mean that he was necessarily critical of Plato. One could imagine this whole edifice of doing philosophy, from Aristotle's perspective, doing it as such is just doing thinking. And then trying to figure out which of these things is first or second philosophy. This is an issue that we could approach in another story. But when Aristotle says that if materiality, for example, as he says in physics, were the only principle, then physics would be first philosophy. But understanding that it's not is the movement into doing ontology. Now again, whether ontology actually has any traction, whether it actually comes to the world, and maybe I'm exaggerating too much, but I think Aristotle would say, that's not our question. Doing ontology is good for itself, for its own sake. And again, I think Heidegger might say something different. Yes.
The one thing I've been picking up is about in Aristotle in oh shoot, now I'm going to have a brain fade. Age didn't do well with me. Is that as he's trying to scope out language, this sort of addresses what Rob was bringing up. I think in some respects, I feel like he's looking to define metaphor, but he hasn't gotten there yet. Would I be safe in saying that? I'm sort of throwing that out there. Because a lot of what he's doing is trying to understand, you apprehend the world, you find the world, you have frameworks for approaching the world, and then how do you express that? And I felt like when you were looking at pedagogy, especially, you were trying to figure out how to get your framework to the student, but at the same time to let the student find their framework.
Yeah, I mean, pedagogically, I don't know where I stand precisely on that issue. I think that was just kind of one of the experiences that I felt maybe it was better to say when I first began teaching, it was something that struck me. as similar to this. I think Aristotle probably does have a pretty developed sensitivity for metaphor and its exhibition in language.
Yeah.
I think, you know, maybe it would be, I think it would deflate some of the issues to say that he's only working on pedagogy, but again, I think that there is something about, for example, the not just ethical, but educational cultivation of learners that Aristotle is interested in. Although I'm not quite sure if that extends much further than that education.
It was Argon and the category, starting with the categories and working through those. You feel like you're reading someone really struggling to find ways to not only apprehend the world, but to then express that express what he or she has apprehended.
Yeah, I mean, of course there's the great debate of where the organon fits in with the rest of Aristotle's work.
Sure.
In terms of whether it was early in the book. I don't believe that that's necessarily true, but it is, as you said, it is something that certainly exhibits this kind of first approach to philosophy, or could be read that way.
Real fast, we just elected Mauricio to president of the Philosophy Club, and so it technically starts at 4:30 on Wednesdays. So I'm going to go over there and create that space. But everybody from here is welcome. Your professors and yourself, especially as an alumni, are all welcome to that at iPi in the Tivoli. Okay, bye.
So we'll put you there.
Other questions for Jeff? Wow, thank you very much.
He jumped the gun. He jumped the gun.
We have lots of food and drink outside, and so we can continue the conversation out here. Okay. Hopefully this works.
Disentangled.